Okay, and our last speaker is Dave Hamre. Welcome back to the stage, another repeat offender. And Dave's going to talk to us a little bit about things he's learned and thought about over 50 years working in the avalanche industry.
Thank you. Actually, it's interesting to be here because they said basically I have the pulpit and I can do anything I want. So that's rewarding. And I guess what I want to do first is I want to sort of set the stage, reiterating some of what Carl said earlier. I've been lucky enough to be in this field now for 50 years. I'm 72, and I started when I was 18. So I've been around a long time, and they kept giving me other guns to shoot, 75 pack, 75 recoilless, 105 recoilless, 105 howitzer, rack systems, all kinds of that stuff. So I'm looking at the sunset of my career with maybe 10,000 rounds under my belt. So I've seen a lot, and I say 10,000 because 10,000 is one of those orders of magnitude, and I want to talk a little bit about orders of magnitude because I don't think that necessarily gets discussed so much. I've got 4 issues I want to talk about. I really want this to be interactive, so if you have questions or something, hop in there. Say something. I'd like to hear your thoughts too. And to that effect, the folks with the microphones are going to need to be ready. So these are the 4 topics I wanted to talk about, and it's intended to be thought-provoking, and it's intended to be a little needly. And this stuff may or may not be true. So I'm just throwing it out there. And these are things I want to talk about that I think are good things to discuss among the group because they're, in my view, real, all of them. And the first thing I wanted to talk about was this distribution of avalanche events. This is my ode to CAIC, because there is their website from 2019. And hopefully whoever helped develop that has been on that. But you know, the interesting thing to me is when I first started my career, there was the old West-wide avalanche network, the blue and green sheets from the Forest Service. The data was actually pretty good. We're looking back now at the data, and that's the best data there is. It's much better than more recent data. You've heard a lot about that in this session. So, but the data here from the big avalanche cycle in 2019 is pretty interesting. I never used to put much credence in the R scale, but the R scale is really indicative that an avalanche produced the largest class size for that path. And out of that cycle, there was a fair amount of R5s, but it's really not that big in the pie. So when you have a big avalanche cycle like 2019, a lot of people might call that a 100-year avalanche event. The reality is, out of a group of avalanche paths, they don't all produce 100-year avalanche events. A lot of them only produce 10-year or even 5-year avalanche events. So I'm not sure why we call it a 100-year avalanche event. But the D scale is another one. As far as I know, the conundrum event from that time period was the only one that received a Class 5 classification. It might have been a couple others. Yeah, well, everybody's really reluctant to call it anything Class 5. So, but it's interesting here because if you look across the bottom of the scale, you know, at March, I believe, 9th, there was a lot of D4s and D5s. There was big avalanches that day. So it's interesting to see the distribution as well across the top. That I don't think the distribution in this case really catches the focus of the avalanche cycle. Maybe it was statewide, but it's probably more focused and more intense in some areas than others. And that's not an uncommon pattern that you see. So one of the things that I've done over the course of my career is look back at data and try to determine why things are the way they are. And this was off a paper I did in 1996, which used the old railroad database of natural avalanche activity. And fortunately, in that database, there was a length and depth of the deposit on the track, which lets you compute volume. And maybe volume's not an exact proxy for the size of the avalanche, but it's a decent proxy. And you could make an argument one way or another. But the interesting thing is I graphed out the 5 largest avalanche events on each path. And what I found out was there was differences in the curves, as you can see in the graph. Most of them had a pretty good high R² value, which is a fit. Now, granted, there's only 5 values, so using R² is an arguable statistical basis for this. But the one event I wanted to point out that stood out is the one at 78.5, where there's 4 events in that path previously. They're all like under 5,000. And then there's this one at 65,000. I mean, it was 40 feet deep and 1,200 feet long on the tracks. That is huge compared to the rest of them. And when I look at all of these paths over a 40-year database, about 30% of them showed a comparable distribution pattern of the volume. And that is coincidentally what the kind of thing that you would expect out of 100-year events. So this is sort of important because many of you work in ski areas and that sort of thing, and you say, well, I've never seen anything that big. I've heard it today several times. I've never seen anything that big. How long have you been around? 20 years maybe? Well, the statistical probability of you seeing a 100-year event in 20 years is like 13% or something. It's pretty small. You could be lucky. I've only seen a few of them. I've been doing it for 50 years and I got 10,000 rounds under my belt. So I've only seen a few really big avalanches, and they are unbelievably much larger than what you can imagine. I won't pick on anybody right now. I could. But this is a distribution curve for an avalanche path. The graph fits pretty well. It's not a bad R² value. There's enough values to get a good R² regression analysis. The power law fits. The big events are much larger, but they still sort of fit the curve really well. This one also fits the curve decently, but the big events are 5 to 8 times as large as the smaller events that happen more frequently. So these rare and large avalanches do occur, and if you hang around long enough, you might be lucky to see one, or unlucky enough to see one of the two. So I asked myself the question, why do we use these temporal terms? Why do we say, well, it's a 10-year event, or it's a 100-year event or something, or a 30-year event, or a 300-year event? Well, I think they're used because we like to see large avalanches. We're all avalanche workers, and we just like to see big stuff, and so we can call it something that gives it a name. Carl and Chris Landry did a paper back in '96 that talked about the frequency-magnitude relationship, and it took the WAN database and distributed them, all of the avalanches that occurred in the WAN database, by the number of avalanches in each class size. And it showed a power law distribution around a half order of magnitude. So what that's telling you is that if you get a class 5, it's going to be 5 times as big as the class 4. And that's pretty profound in my view. So the D scale anticipates 1 order of magnitude, but I think that's the core and the basis for why there's a reluctance to call something a class 5, because they are, by a D scale and SWAG standards, unbelievably large. And so I think everybody's doing their thing by not classifying them at that, but I wonder about that. And also the D size is sort of subject to the observer. When I cut my teeth at Alta, We knew what a class 5 looked like because Binks or Ron Perler or Ed LaChapelle told us what it was, and so we believed it. You were young guys. And if you go back in the records and you look, you see a lot more class 5s than there is now. It wasn't because the avalanches are bigger. So in some ways, the R size may be more relevant. So I go back to the thought-provoking question, how many 100-year events are there in a 10-year cycle? And how many 10-year events in a 100-year cycle? Anybody know? I don't think there's an answer, by the way. So it depends a lot, but you're going to see 100-year events in a 10-year cycle, and you're going to see lots of 10-year events in a 100-year cycle. That's about all I know about it. So the other thing that I wanted to talk about, and at some point I wanted to do a paper on, but I'm sort of running out of time to do papers on this kind of stuff. But I wanted to talk a little bit about cumulative risk and collective risk. And cumulative risk is the kind of risk you take as an individual. Somebody showed, I think it was Ava, showed a picture of somebody looking down, Wendy looking down a slope, deciding today whether to ski that slope or not. And that is the tendency of all of us avalanche workers. The tendency is not to ask yourself whether you can ski that 1,000 times without an incident. And in the course of a lifetime, guess what? You're going to ski that slope 1,000 times. So maybe you're not asking the right question. Maybe you should ask yourself, is it 1 in 10 today or 1 in 100? Most people wouldn't risk their lives on 1 in 100 that I know of. So I think it's a good question. And I think that drives the issue that heli guides seem to be pretty young. There's very few heli guides that are old. You know, Jake Hutchinson's working at Irving now, and he's seasoned. He's one of the few. You're almost guaranteed he's got a whole bunch of younger guides. At about 10 years, the light bulb comes on with heli skiing that you're actually taking a lot of risk, and maybe you want to live to be an old guy. Probably a good plan. But there are ways of continuing on. You just have to cut your risk. So that's the cumulative risk. And ski patrollers, same way. I remember the story of Big Wally at Jackson, who ran the same route for 30 years. And 31st year, and I'm making up the story, I don't know the exact statistics, but there was a spot in the route where you had to climb up maybe 20 feet to go over a roll to avoid any exposure, but he'd always go around the roll, and he got away with that for 30 years. But there was one day that there was a slab sitting on that roll at like 30 degrees, and it slid with him, took him down in the trees, and that was the end of Big Wally. And so, you know, I think you got to be careful of that kind of stuff. And so I think a lot about cumulative risk in your own arena. And then the other thing that I think is important is to think about collective risk. And I'm going to use snowmass as an example. We did an audit for Aspen Ski Corp a few years ago, and I was impressed by snowmass. And what I was impressed by is the fact that they got 100 pockets out there that are all faceted, and they're all potential places for somebody to get trapped and caught and die in the trees. Small avalanches, but 100 of them. It's really a lot of risk, and you have to send patrollers out there to boot pack every single one of them. Well, there's a lot of risk in sending people out in the woods to boot pack all those packs. And so I think this is really important for the team members or the heads of the teams to think about in terms of cumulative risk, or collective risk, I'm sorry. But I also know that maybe some awareness and the training can help in this situation. This is a little bit of a pitch. We've been progressively going to ISSWs, and we see more and more papers from PhD students who are modeling something that they have no background in. And their papers are, half of them are not supported by any facts, they're just theories. And that's all great. I think you can't advance the state of the art without that. But all of you are practitioners, a lot of you are practitioners. I guarantee you have some good ideas about what to do for some kind of something you'd like to investigate. Well, if you do, then get with some of these folks here in the Geeks Gallery down here, and find somebody to help you with that. I was recently talking to the Assistant Snow Safety Director at Solitude, and he was describing how they'd installed some rack systems under honeycomb cliffs. And the rack systems had knocked the snow off, and the snowpack was now faceted, but they also had a place that wasn't faceted. Well, that's a really interesting study right there. That's a practitioner study. And I almost guarantee you, if you stop and think about it, you've got places where you can do that stuff. So get with somebody, do a paper. There's ISSW is coming back to North America, probably be at Snowbird in 4 years. And be ready. Go do your study, and get somebody to fund you to do that. Another story. I'll get to that. So I don't think that what I'm talking about is necessarily exactly true anymore, but I believe there's some truth to what I have to say, which is that, ski patrollers, the earliest, I got on the Alta Ski Patrol in 1970, and that Pro Patrol went back to 1948 there. That's a long time ago. They learned how to sleep in shacks, they did their watch at the top, and the general manager even built a ski shack so the ski patrol couldn't sleep in it. Small and tight, But there's a lot of cultural norms in a ski patrol, and every one of you that's sitting in this room is subject to some of that. There's also, I think, a strong undercurrent. Maybe this is the thing of the past, but I don't think so necessarily. It's in the culture that duct tape and baling wire is going to take care of things. So when somebody says, no, you can't have money to do your paper, you need to find another way of expressing that so that it's not duct tape and baling wire. And they did that because ski areas are broke for many years. And I'm going to give you an example. I worked at a mountain in Canada for a year, and I was on my way to Alaska. And the year before, they'd lost a lot of people out of the boundary. And so we're going it's sort of like one of those ephemeral boundary lines. If you just get a little too far one way, you're out there 12 miles in the middle of god-awful nowhere. They had 7 out-of-bounds rescues the year before. So I said, well, we can fix this. We'll just put in a perimeter fence. They said, oh, that's fine, but we're broke. Can you do it with baling wire? I asked for polypro. What I got was baling twine, 2 miles of baling twine. It worked. We didn't have any rescues. So, the can-do attitude prevails, but modern ski corps are not that way. I hate to pick on Vail because a lot of you work for Vail, and it could be anybody. It doesn't have to be Vail. It could be any big ski corp. I asked Ethan whether anybody contributed to the CAIC. Did any of these big corporations that made $800 million last year? By the way, their capital program was $300 million. Where'd the other $500 million go? So that's, and yeah, I've heard a lot of grumbling about this issue. I heard it at ISSW and probably hear it here. So they're doing good things, but they're really keen on return on investment. So I think as ski patrollers, the onus is on us as team leaders to change the way that we ask for things sometimes, ask in a different way. Because the corporate bosses are going to be responsive to issues of legalities. Their worker safety issues are pretty big, and they're open to things that can produce a better ROI, and they're not aware of the patroller traditions, generally speaking. So I use this as an example. This is sort of not a great image, but you can see a light green cat track running through there. This is the cat track from Blackcomb. I was there almost 20 years ago talking to Anton, the snow safety director. And he was expressing a lot of concern because when they opened Blackcomb Glacier in that whole basin, thousands of people go back in there, and they all have to get on that cat track and exit at the end of their run. So all day long, there's a perpetual traffic. And in order to deal with that, he's got to send people into these, everywhere that's red is steep enough to avalanche. He's got to send patrollers in there to throw bombs in the trees and ferret out the pockets of wet snow. This is really risky, and there's always incidents that happen that hit the track. This is 20 years ago, and they still don't have a rack. He was saying at the time that he wanted a rack system so he didn't have to send people in there, and they could do a better job. They still don't have that. And to me, this is a situation where it cries for a different way of putting the problem. And I'm not throwing any arrows at anybody about doing this. I'm just saying that there's lots of different ways of expressing what you want your end goal to be. So don't be bashful. That's my message to all of you. And so the one last thing I wanted to talk about was every time you do risk reduction, it's easy to get an initial reduction. When you look at a problem, an avalanche problem, it's easy to get an initial risk reduction. It's harder to get long-term, and it costs a lot more money. Eventually, you get to the point where you're not reducing the risk very much, and it's costing lots of money. So somewhere in there is a balance point, and you'll have to figure that out for yourself, where that is. This is one I did for the Alaska Railroad, but the slide zones and the explosives, using the explosives and the rest of that were pretty easy. But when we get to the dirt, moving dirt, they did that part, and the sheds are just enormously expensive for a very modest risk reduction. It's like playing whack-a-mole. They got 30 paths, and you can put sheds on one, but that only reduces the risk by a little bit. Still got 29 paths. So I ask you, what is the one thing that you can't buy at a ski area anymore? There's lots of things you can buy at a ski area, but the one thing that you can't buy is more than one run of powder. That's what you're selling. You're out there selling the runs of powder. So I hope you get more of them. Thanks.
That's great. Thanks, Dave. Keep that on.
Thanks, Dave. That was great. Any questions for Dave? I know you can catch him out on the lawn as well, but if anybody sticks up their hand, we'll give you one last chance. All right, down in front.
Do you think some of these big corporations will, I know some have already, gone to unionizing the patrol to help out with their risk reduction?
I don't really want to get into the whole, that's really for every individual person to figure out whether they want to be in a union or not, and whether that, I think that what you're seeing in that unionization process is a frustration with where we're at. And the outcome of that, I'm not going to advocate one way or another. That's for everybody to decide for themselves.
I appreciate that, but
Yeah.
I appreciate that, but it's one of those things that the question is posed with what you posed.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Any other questions for Dave? I know there was a lot in there. That was some good stuff.